Good evening from Sacred Space at Titania's Realm. The time is 6:29 p.m. on the 1st of July 2025. We're into the 7th month. Time is flying by. Had a beautiful day. It was cold and a bit windy, but I put the birds outside, and those of you who regularly watch this channel would have seen the video I made earlier of the little boy birds outside, but I quickly brought them in again because the wind got a bit cold and I didn't think it was good for them. Anyway, they're living quite contentedly with the mama tea at Sacred Space. I went to check on them just as the sun was going down, get them ready for sleep, and little Kermie was already sitting on his swinging. Apparently he sleeps on the swing at night, which is a bit weird, but it's his swing and his cage and his lifestyle, and he's a happy little fella, so it's all good. And I just cooked a lovely soup with a cooked chicken, and I threw in mushrooms and tinned cream corn and celery and a zucchini, and I think that was everything. And 2 potatoes and some noodles, 2-minute noodles, and anyway, very delicious it turned out too. I've got it on the bench. I'm cooling it down before I put it in the freezer. So it's been a lovely day, and I even cooked a nice meal. Well, the chicken was already cooked. I just bought a cooked chicken from Woolworths, and I've just been living on soups all winter long, actually since about May, really, autumn, and really enjoying it. Just fairly good healthy meals, and easy to prepare and freeze down, have something extra for when there's days or nights when I don't feel like cooking at all, so it's good to have something in the freezer for times like that when I just can't be asked. Anyway, I'm sitting on my couch reading to you because the light bulb in my lamp on my desk, where my desk is where I normally read from, popped, and I tried putting in a normal light bulb, and it just gave me a little bit of a charge. I thought, there's too much power running through that thing, so I don't want to get myself A, electrocuted, or B, blow out that lovely antique lamp, so I'm just going to have to wait for it till I get round to buying another little 40-watt lamp bulb. It's always a pain in the ass because you go down and buy the little light bulbs, and sometimes I come home with the wrong fitting, like either slim fittings that fit none of my things except for, I think, the desk lamp in the studio. But so I've got all these fittings that don't fit anything, and it's very frustrating and annoying. So I have to remember to get the right size fittings, like the normal large fitting, but just a little lamp like that big. I'll have to remember. I might try and do it tomorrow. It was weird because I was down at Woolies buying the chicken, completely forgot that I needed that little light bulb. So we're uncomfortably perched on the couch reading to you from the only light source in this room, which is the overhead light, which isn't all that bright either, to be honest. Which I don't particularly mind because when I'm watching TV I don't like having glare in my eyes. But anyway, it's all a bit weird, people there, but that's why I'm sitting here instead of perched up at my wonderful Camphor Loyal slab desk that I made not long after I first moved in here 22 years ago. So anyway, today's story is called A Man from Glasgow. It is not often that anyone entering a great city for the first time has the luck to witness such an incident as engaged Shelley's attention when he drove into Naples. A youth ran out of a shop pursued by a man armed with a knife. I sharpened all my knives tonight too. Talk about synchronicity. The man overtook him, and with one blow in the neck laid him dead on the road. Shelley had a tender heart. He didn't look upon it as a bit of local colour. He was seized with horror and indignation. But when he expressed his emotions to a Calabrian priest who was travelling with him, a fellow of gigantic strength and stature, the priest laughed heartily and attempted to quiz him. Shelley says he never felt such an inclination to beat anyone. I have never seen anything so exciting as that, but the first time I went to Algeciras, I had an experience that seemed to me far from ordinary. Algeciras or Algeciras, I don't know how to pronounce that, obviously, people. Pretend I'm not here. But I'm struggling. Algeciras was then an untidy, neglected town. I arrived somewhat late at night and went to an inn on the quay. It was rather shabby, but it had a fine view of Gibraltar, solid and matter-of-fact, across the bay. The moon was full, the office was on the first floor, and a slatternly maid, when I asked for a room, took me upstairs. The landlord was playing cards. He seemed little pleased to see me. He looked me up and down, curtly gave me a number, and then, taking no further notice of me, went on with his game. When the maid had shown me to my room, I asked her what I could have to eat. What you like, she answered. I knew well enough the unreality of the seeming profusion. What have you got in the house? You can have eggs and ham. The look of the hotel had led me to guess that I should get little else. The maid led me to a narrow room with whitewashed walls and a low ceiling, in which was a long table laid already for the next day's luncheon. With his back to the door sat a tall man, huddled over a brasero, the round brass dish of hot ashes, which is erroneously supposed to give sufficient warmth for the temperate winter of Andalusia. I sat down at table and waited for my scanty meal. I gave the stranger an idle glance. He was looking at me, but meeting my eyes, he quickly turned away. I waited for my eggs. When at last the maid brought them, he looked up again. I want you to wake me in time for the first boat, he said. Si, signor. His accent told me that English was his native tongue, and the breadth of his build, his strongly marked features, led me to suppose him a northerner. The hardy Scot is far more often found in Spain than the Englishman. Whether you go to the rich mines of Rio Tinto, or to the bodegas of Jerez, to Seville, or to Cadiz, it is the leisurely speech of beyond the Tweed that you hear. You will meet Scotsmen in the olive groves of Carmona, on the railway between Algeciras and Bobadilla, and even on the remote cork woods of Merida. I finished eating and walked over to the dish of burning ashes. It was midwinter, and the windy passage across the bay had chilled my blood. The man pushed his chair away as I drew mine forwards. Don't move, I said. There's heaps of room for two. I lit a cigar and offered one to him. In Spain, the Havana from Jib is never unwelcome. I don't mind if I do, he said, stretching out his hand. I recognised the singing speech of Glasgow, but the stranger was not talkative, and my efforts at conversation broke down before his monosyllables. We smoked in silence. He was even bigger than I had thought, with great broad shoulders and ungainly limbs. His face was sunburned, his hair short and grizzled. His features were hard, mouth, ears and nose were large and heavy, and his skin much wrinkled. His blue eyes were pale. He was constantly pulling his ragged grey moustache. It was a nervous gesture that I found faintly irritating. Presently I felt that he was looking at me, and the intensity of his stare grew so irksome that I glanced up expecting him, as before, to drop his eyes. He did, indeed, for a moment, but then raised them again. He inspected me from under his long, bushy eyebrows. Just come from Jib? He asked suddenly. Yes. I'm going tomorrow on my way home, thank God. He said the last two words so fiercely that I smiled. Don't you like Spain? Oh, Spain's all right. Have you been here long? Too long, too long. He spoke with a kind of gasp. I was surprised at the emotion my casual inquiry seemed to excite in him. He sprang to his feet and walked backwards and forwards. He stamped to and fro like a caged beast, pushing aside a chair that stood in his way, and now and again repeated the words in a groan. Too long, too long. I sat still. I was embarrassed. To give myself countenance, I stirred the brasero to bring the hotter ashes to the top, and he stood suddenly still, towering over me. As though my movement had brought back my existence to his notice. Then he sat down heavily in his chair. Do you think I'm queer? He asked. Not more than most people, I smiled. You don't see anything strange in me? I sound more Yorkshire than Glaswegian. I think I better give it up. Just one moment, I'm just going to lock my front door. Right. Now, where were we? He leant forward as he spoke, so that I might see him well. No. You'd say if you did, wouldn't you? I would. I couldn't quite understand what all this meant. I wondered if he was drunk. For 2 or 3 minutes he didn't say anything, and I had no wish to interrupt the silence. What's your name? He asked suddenly. I told him. Mine's Robert Morrison. Scotch? Glasgow. I've been in this blasted country for years. Got any baccy? I gave him my pouch, and he filled his pipe. He lit it from a piece of burning charcoal. I can't stay any longer. I've stayed too long, too long. He had an impulse to jump up again and walk up and down, but he resisted it, clinging to his chair. I saw on his face the effort he was making. I judged that his restlessness was due to chronic alcoholism. I find drunks very boring, and I made up my mind to take an early opportunity of slipping off to bed. I've been managing some olive groves, he went on. I'm here working for the Glasgow and South of Spain Olive Oil Company Limited. Oh yes. We've got a new process for refining oil, you know. Properly treated, Spanish oil is every bit as good as Lucca, and we can sell it cheaper. He spoke in a dry, matter-of-fact, business-like way. He chose his words with Scotch precision. He seemed perfectly sober. You know, Iquique is more or less the centre of the olive trade, and we had a Spaniard there to look after the business, but I found he was robbing us right and left, so I had to turn him out. I used to live in Seville. It was more convenient for shipping the oil. However, I found I couldn't get a trustworthy man to be at Iquique, so last year I went there myself. Do you know it? No. The firm has got a big estate 2 miles from the town, just outside the village of San Lorenzo, and it's got a fine house on it. It's on the crest of a hill, rather pretty to look at, all white, you know, and straggling, with a couple of storks perched on the roof. No one lived there, and I thought it would save the rent of a place in town if I did. It must have been a bit lonely, I remarked. It was. Robert Morrison smoked on for a minute or two in silence. I wondered whether there was any point in what he was telling me. I looked at my watch. In a hurry? He asked sharply. Not particularly. It's getting late. Well, what of it? I suppose you didn't see many people, I said, going back. Not many. I lived there with an old man and his wife who looked after me, and sometimes I used to go down to the village and play tresillo with Fernandez, the chemist, and 1 or 2 men who met at his shop. I used to shoot a bit and ride. Doesn't sound such a bad life to me. I'd been there 2 years last spring. By God, I've never known such heat as we had in May. No one could do a thing. The labourers just lay about in the shade and slept. Sheep died and some of the animals went mad. Even the oxen couldn't work. They stood around with their backs all humped up and gasped for breath. I swear to God, if I'm looking antsy, it's because I sat down to begin this video. It is windy outside, but as I sat down to begin this video, my door, which is still slightly open, kind of made a creaking sound of opening up. It didn't open much, only a tiny bit. Oh well, that's fine. That's the wind. Then there was that loud bang on the roof. Then I got the urge to lock the front door and keep it locked in case someone randomly just turns up on my doorstep uninvited. And that's the feeling I've got, like perhaps the BCC are going to turn up uninvited again. They wouldn't dare though, would they? Mind you, they turned up on Sunday uninvited, and I told them to come and do the work in daylight hours. And, well, it's Tuesday, haven't turned up, haven't heard from them. So now I'm hyper-vigilant and antsy, waiting for something or someone to arrive or make its presence known. Sometimes it's spirit too. It's a bit odd, isn't it? Just when I'm sitting down to read to you, YouTube. Well, anyway, on we go and on we go. I don't let these things get to me. I just get on with life, you know what I mean? Otherwise, it's crazy making. You would actually go crazy. But yes. Right, and I'm perfectly safe here, and you know everything's fine. So I'm not fearful. I'm just feeling like there's some sort of anticipatory kind of expectation type energy, as if something or someone is about to, turn up. Not necessarily an unpleasant, experience, but it's just a bit odd. It's probably the wind, and we're gearing up for some rough weather again, it says, so that's probably why I'm feeling heightened, people of Earth. Right, anyway, where were we? The oxen all humped up and gasped for breath. That blasted sun beat down and the glare was so awful you felt your eyes would shoot out of your head. It's awful painful, that. The earth cracked and crumbled and the crops frizzled. The olives went to rack and ruin. It was simply hell. One couldn't get a wink of sleep. I went from room to room trying to get a breath of air. Of course I kept the windows shut and had the floors watered, but that didn't do any good. One would think you would open the windows and let whatever breeze there was come through. It's what we do here in Queensland anyway, by the gods. The nights were just as hot as the days, although sometimes we draw the curtains against the heat to keep everything shut. But I try and catch a breeze, because of my lungs I like to have air flowing through. The nights were just as hot as the days. It was like living in an oven. At last I thought I'd have a bed made up for me downstairs on the north side of the house, in a room that was never used because in ordinary weather it was damp. I had an idea that I might get a few hours' sleep there at all events. Anyhow, it was worth trying. But it was no damned good. It was a washout. I turned and tossed, and my bed was so hot that I couldn't stand it. I got up and opened the doors that led to the veranda and walked out. It was a glorious night. The moon was so bright that I swear you could read a book by it. Did I tell you the house was on the crest of a hill? I leant against the parapet and looked at the olive trees. It was like the sea. I suppose that's what made me think of home. I thought of the cool breeze in the fir trees and the racket of the streets in Glasgow. Believe it or not, I could smell them, and I could smell the sea. By God, I'd have given every bob I had in the world for an hour of that air. They say it's a foul climate in Glasgow. Don't you believe it? I like the rain and the grey sky and that yellow sea and the waves. I forgot that I was in Spain, in the middle of the olive country, and I opened my breath and took a long breath as though I were breathing in the sea fog. And then all of a sudden I heard a sound. It was a man's voice. Not loud, you know, low. It seemed to creep through the silence like, well, I don't know what it was like. It surprised me. I couldn't think who could be down there in the olives at that hour. It was past midnight. It was a chap laughing, a funny sort of laugh. I suppose you'd call it a chuckle. It seemed to crawl up the hill disjointedly. Morris looked at me to see how I took the odd word he used to express a sensation that he didn't know how to describe. I mean, it seemed to shoot up in little jerks, something like shooting stones out of a pail. I leant forward and stared. With the full moon it was almost as light as day, but I'm dashed if I could see a thing. The sound stopped, but I kept on looking at where it had come from, in case somebody moved. And in a minute it started off again, but louder. You couldn't have called it a chuckle any more. It was a real belly laugh. It just rang through the night. I wondered if it didn't wake my servants. It sounded like someone who was roaring drunk. "Who's there?" I shouted. The only answer I got was a roar of laughter. I don't mind telling you I was getting a bit annoyed. I had half a mind to go down and see what it was all about. I wasn't going to let some drunken swine kick up a row like that on my place in the middle of the night. And then, suddenly, there was a yell. By God, I was startled. Then cries. The man had laughed with a deep bass voice, but his cries were shrill, like a pig having his throat cut. "My God!" I cried. I jumped over the parapet and ran down towards the sound. I thought somebody was being killed. There was silence, and then one piercing shriek. After that sobbing and moaning, I'll tell you what it sounded like. It sounded like someone at the point of death. There was a long groan, then nothing. Silence. I ran from place to place. I couldn't find anyone. At last I climbed the hill again and went back to my room. You can imagine how much sleep I got that night. As soon as it was light, I looked out of the window in the direction from which the row had come, and I was surprised to see a little white house in a sort of dale among the olives. The ground on that side of didn't belong to us, and I'd never been through it. I hardly ever went to that part of the house, and so I'd never seen the house before. I asked Jose who lived there. He told me that a madman had inhabited it with his brother and a servant. Oh, Was that the explanation? I said. Not a very nice neighbour. The Scot bent over quickly and seized my wrist. He thrust his face into mine, and his eyes were staring out of his head with terror. The madman had been dead for 20 years, he whispered. He let go my wrist and leaned back in his chair, panting. I went down to the house and walked all round it. The windows were barred and shuttered, and the door was locked. I knocked. I shook the handle and rang the bell. I heard it tinkle, but no one came. Pardon me. It was a 2-story house, and I looked up. The shutters were tight closed, and there wasn't a sign of life anywhere. Well, what sort of condition was the house in? I asked. Oh, rotten. The whitewash had worn off the walls, and there was practically no paint left on the door or the shutters. Some of the tiles off the roof were lying on the ground. They looked as though they'd been blown away in a gale. Queer, I said. They mean an old-fashioned meaning of that word, meaning strange or odd or out of the ordinary. I know, but modern parlance has altered quite a few words. And some of you young folks don't know what the original meanings were. Queer, I said. I went to my friend Fernandez, the chemist, and he told me the same story as Jose. I asked about the madman, and Fernandez said that no one ever saw him. He was more or less comatose ordinarily, but now and then he had an attack of acute mania, and then he could be heard from ever so far, laughing his head off and then crying. It used to scare people. He died in one of his attacks, and his keepers cleared out at once. No one had ever dared to live in the house since. I didn't tell Fernandez what I'd heard. I thought he'd only laugh at me. I stayed up that night and kept watch. But nothing happened. There wasn't a sound. I waited about till dawn, and then I went to bed. And you never heard anything more? Not for a month. The drought continued, and I went on sleeping in the lumber room at the back. One night I was fast asleep when something seemed to happen to me. I don't exactly know how to describe it. It was a funny feeling, as though someone had given me a little nudge to warn me, and suddenly I was wide awake. I lay there in my bed, and then, in the same way as before, I heard a long, low gurgle, like a man enjoying an old joke. It came from way down in the valley, and it got louder. It was a great bellow of laughter. I jumped out of bed and went to the window. My legs began to tremble. It was horrible to stand there and listen to the shouts of laughter that rang through the night. Then there was the pause, and after that a shriek of pain and that ghastly sobbing. It didn't sound human. I mean, you might have thought it was an animal being tortured. I don't mind telling you, I was scared stiff. I couldn't have moved if I'd wanted to. After a time, the sound stopped, not suddenly, but dying away, little by little. I strained my ears, but I couldn't hear a thing. I crept back to bed and hid my face. I remembered then that Fernandez had told me that the madman's attacks only came at intervals. The rest of the time he was quite quiet. Apathetic, Fernandez said. I wondered if the fits of mania came regularly. I reckoned out how long it had been between the two attacks I'd heard. 28 days. It didn't take me long to put two and two together. It was quite obvious that it was the full moon that set him off. I'm not a nervous man, really, and I made up my mind to get to the bottom of it. So I looked out in the calendar which day the moon would be full next, and that night I didn't go to bed. I cleaned my revolver and loaded it. I prepared a lantern and sat down on the parapet of my house to wait. I felt perfectly cool. To tell you the truth, I was rather pleased with myself because I didn't feel scared. There was a bit of a wind and it whistled about the roof. It rustled over the leaves of the olive trees like waves swishing on the pebbles of the beach. A moon rose on the white walls of the house in the hollow. I felt particularly cheery. At last I heard a little sound, the sound I knew, and I almost laughed. I was right. It was the full moon, and the attacks came as regular as clockwork. That was all to the good. I threw myself over the wall into the olive grove and ran straight to the house. The chuckling grew louder as I came near. I got to the house and looked up. There was no light anywhere. I put my ears to the door and listened. I heard the madman simply laughing his bloody head off. I bet on the door with my fist and I pulled the bell. The sound of it seemed to amuse him. He roared with laughter. I knocked again, louder and louder, and the more I knocked, the more he laughed. Then I shouted at the top of my voice, "Open the blasted door or I'll break it down." I stepped back and kicked the latch with all my might. I flung myself at the door with the whole weight of my body. It cracked. Then I put all my strength into it, and the damned thing smashed open. I took the revolver out of my pocket and held my lantern in the other hand. The laughter sounded louder now that the door was opened. I stepped in. The stink nearly knocked me down. I mean, just think, the windows hadn't been opened for 20 years. The row was enough to raise the dead, but for a moment I didn't know where it was coming from. The walls seemed to throw the sound backwards and forwards. I pushed open a door by my side and went into a room. It was bare and white, and there wasn't a stick of furniture in it. The sound was louder and I followed it. I went into another room, but there was nothing there. I opened a door and found myself at the foot of a staircase. The madman was laughing just over my head. I walked up cautiously, you know. I wasn't taking any risks, and at the top of the stairs there was a passage. I walked along it, throwing my light ahead of me, and I came to a room at the end. I stopped. He wasn't there. I was only separated from the sound by a thin door. It was awful to hear it. A shiver passed through me, and I cursed myself because I began to tremble. It wasn't like a human being at all. By Jove, I very nearly took to my heels and ran. I had to clench my teeth to force myself to stay, but I simply couldn't bring myself to turn the handle. And then the laughter was cut with a knife, you'd have said, and I heard a hiss of pain. I hadn't heard that before. It was too low to carry to my place. And then a gasp. I heard the man speak in Spanish. You're killing me. Take it away. Oh God, help me. He screamed. The brutes were torturing him. I flung open the door and burst in. The draught blew a shutter back, and the moon streamed in so bright that it dimmed my lantern. In my ears, as clearly as I hear you speak, and as close, I heard the wretched chap's groans. It was awful, moaning and sobbing and frightful gasps. No one could survive that. He was at the point of death. I tell you, I heard his broken, choking cries right in my ears. And the room was empty. Robert Morrison sank back in his chair. That huge, solid man had strangely the look of a lay figure in a studio. You felt that if you pushed him, he would fall over in a heap onto the floor. And then, I asked. He took a rather dirty handkerchief out of his pocket and wiped his forehead. I felt I didn't much want to sleep in that room on the north side, so, heat or no heat, I moved back to my own quarters. Well, exactly 4 weeks later, about 2 in the morning, I was waked up by the madman's chuckle. It was almost at my elbow. I don't mind telling you that my nerve was a bit shaken by then, so next time the blighter was due to have an attack, next time the moon was full, I got Fernandez to come and spend the night with me. I didn't tell him anything. I kept him up playing cards till 2 in the morning, and then I heard it again. I asked him if he heard anything. Nothing, he said. There's somebody laughing, I said. You're drunk, man, he said, and he began laughing too. That was too much. Shut up, you fool, I said. The laughter grew louder and louder. I cried out. I tried to shut it out by putting my hands to my ears, but it wasn't a damned bit of good. I heard it, and I heard the scream of pain. Fernandez thought I was mad. He didn't dare say so, because he knew I'd have killed him. He said he'd go to bed, and in the morning I found he'd slunk away. His bed hadn't been slept in. He'd taken himself off when he left me. After that, I couldn't stop in Iquique. I made a factor there and went back to Seville. I wonder what they mean by I made a factor there. And went back to Seville. I felt myself pretty safe there, but as the time came near, I began to get scared. Of course, I told myself not to be a damned fool, but I damned well couldn't help myself. The fact is, I was afraid the sounds had followed me, and I knew if I heard them in Seville, I'd go on hearing them all my life. I've got as much courage as any man, but, damn it all, there are limits to everything. Flesh and blood couldn't stand it. I knew I'd go stark, staring mad. I got in such a state that I began drinking. The suspense was so awful, and I used to lie awake counting the days. And, at last, I knew it had come, and it came. I heard those sounds in Seville, 60 miles away from Iquique. I didn't know what to say. I was silent for a while. When did you hear the sounds last? I asked. 4 weeks ago. I looked up quickly. I was startled. What do you mean by that? It's not full moon tonight. He gave me a dark, angry look. He opened his mouth to speak and then stopped as though he couldn't. You would have said his vocal cords were paralyzed, and it was with a strange croak that at last he answered, "Yes, it is." He stared at me, and his pale blue eyes seemed to shine red. I have never seen in a man's face a look of such terror. He got up quickly and stalked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. I must admit that I didn't sleep any too well that night myself. That was the end of that story. Another random ending. Nothing really, and I don't like how that one ended. Disappointed in that one. It was a nice, good, scary horror story, but wow. Anywho, people of Earth. The next story is, let's see if it's a long or short one. Is it long or short at all? Is it big and strong? Is it long and thin? It's a fairly longish one. By the gods. Well, anyway, we'll soldier through. Before the party, Mrs. Skinner liked to be in good time. She was already dressed in black silk as befitted her age and the mourning she wore for her son-in-law, and now she put on her toque. She was a little uncertain about it, since the egret's feathers which adorned it might very well arouse in some of the friends she would certainly meet at the party acid expostulations, and of course it was shocking to kill those beautiful white birds in the mating season too, for the sake of their feathers, but there they were, so pretty and stylish, and it would have been silly to refuse them, and it would have hurt her son-in-law's feelings. He had brought them all the way from Borneo, and he expected her to be so pleased with them. Kathleen had made herself rather unpleasant about them. She must wish she hadn't now, after what had happened, but Kathleen had never really liked Harold. Mrs. Skinner, standing at her dressing table, placed the toque on her head. 'Twas, after all, the only nice hat she had, and put a pin with a large jet knob. If anybody spoke to her about the ospreys, she had her answer. I know it's dreadful, she would say, and I wouldn't dream of buying them, but my poor son-in-law brought them back the last time he was home on leave. That would explain her possession of them and excuse their use. Everyone had been very kind. Mrs. Skinner took a clean handkerchief from a drawer and sprinkled a little eau de cologne on it. She never used scent, and she'd always thought it rather fast, but eau de cologne was so refreshing. It was my mother's favourite scent too, for 7-Eleven eau de cologne. She was very nearly ready now, and her eyes wandered out of the window behind her looking-glass. Canon Hayward had a beautiful day for his garden party. It was warm and the sky was blue. The trees had not yet lost the fresh green of the spring. She smiled as she saw her little granddaughter in the strip of garden behind the house, busily raking her very own flower bed. Mrs. Skinner wished Joan were not quite so pale. It was a mistake to have kept her so long in the tropics, and she was so grey for her age. You never saw her run about. She played quiet games of her own invention and watered her garden. Mrs. Skinner gave the front of her dress a little pat, took up her gloves, and went downstairs. Kathleen was at the writing table in the window, busy with lists she was making, for she was honorary secretary of the Ladies' Golf Club, and when there were competitions, had a good deal to do. But she too was ready for the party. I see you've put on your jumper after all, said Mrs. Skinner. They had discussed at luncheon whether Kathleen would wear her jumper or her black chiffon. The jumper was black and white, and Kathleen thought it rather smart, but it was hardly mourning. Millicent, however, was in favour of it. There's no reason why we should all look as if we've just come from a funeral, she said. Harold's been dead 8 months. To Mrs. Skinner it seemed rather unfeeling to talk like that. Millicent was strange since her return from Borneo. You're not going to leave off your weeds yet, darling? She asked. Millicent did not give a direct answer. People don't wear mourning in the way they used, she said. She paused a little, and when she went on, there was a tone in her voice which Mrs. Skinner thought quite peculiar. It was plain that Kathleen noticed it too, for she gave her sister a curious look. I'm sure Harold wouldn't wish me to wear mourning for him indefinitely. I dressed early because I wanted to say something to Millicent, said Kathleen in reply to her mother's observation. Oh? Kathleen did not explain, but she put her lists aside and with knitted brows read for the second time a letter from a lady who complained that the committee had most unfairly marked down her handicap from 24 to 18. It requires a good deal of tact to be honorary secretary to a ladies' golf club. Mrs. Skinner began to put on her new gloves. The sun blinds kept the room cool and dark. She looked at the great wooden hornbill, gaily painted, which Harold had left in her safekeeping, and it seemed a little odd and barbaric to her that he had set much store on it. It had some religious significance, and Canon Hayward had been greatly struck by it. On the wall, over the sofa, were Malay weapons. She forgot what they were called, and here and there, on occasional tables, pieces of silver and brass, which Harold, at various times, had sent to them. She had liked Harold, and involuntarily her eyes sought his photograph, which stood on the piano, with photographs of her two daughters, her grandchild, her sister, and her sister's son. "Why, Kathleen, where's Harold's photograph?" she asked. Kathleen looked round. It no longer stood in its place. "Someone's taken it away," said Kathleen. Surprised and puzzled, she got up and went over to the piano. The photographs had been rearranged so that no gap should show. "Perhaps Millicent wanted to have it in her bedroom," said Mrs. Skinner. "I should have noticed it. Besides, Millicent has several photographs of Harold. She keeps them locked up." Mrs. Skinner had thought it very peculiar that her daughter should have no photographs of Harold in her room. Indeed, she had spoken of it once, but Millicent had made no reply. Millicent had been strangely silent since she came back from Borneo, and had not encouraged the sympathy Mrs. Skinner would have been so willing to show her. She seemed unwilling to speak of her great loss. Sorrow took people in different ways. Her husband had said the best thing was to leave her alone. The thought of him turned her ideas to the party they were going to. "Father asked if I thought he ought to wear a top hat," she said. I said I thought it was just as well to be on the safe side." It was going to be quite a grand affair. They were having ices, strawberry and vanilla, from Body, the confectioner, but the Haywoods were making the iced coffee at home. Everyone would be there. They had been asked to meet the Bishop of Hong Kong, who was staying with the canon, an old college friend of his, and he was going to speak on the Chinese missions. Mrs. Skinner, whose daughter had lived in the East for 8 years, and whose son-in-law had been resident of a district in Borneo, was in a flutter of interest. Naturally, it meant more to her than to people who had never had anything to do with the colonies and that sort of thing. "What can they know of England who only England know?" as Mr. Skinner said. He came into the room at that moment. He was a lawyer, as his father had been before him, and he had offices in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Lincoln's Inn Fields. Okay. He went up to London every morning and came down every evening. He was only able to accompany his wife and daughters to the canon's garden party, because the canon had very wisely chosen a Saturday to have it on. Mr. Skinner looked very well in his tailcoat and pepper and salt trousers. He was not exactly dressy, but he was neat. He looked like a respectable family solicitor, which indeed he was. His firm never touched work that was not perfectly above board, and if a client went to him with some trouble that was not quite nice, Mr. Skinner would look grave. "I don't think this is the sort of case that we're very much care to undertake, he said. I think you do better to go elsewhere. He drew towards him his writing block and scribbled a name and address on it. He tore off a sheet of paper and handed it to his client. If I were you, I think I would go and see these people. If you mention my name, I believe they'll do anything they can for you. Mr. Skinner was clean-shaven and very bald. His pale lips were tight and thin, and his blue eyes were shy. He had no colour in his cheeks, and his face was much lined. I see you've put on your new trousers, said Mrs. Skinner. I thought it would be a good opportunity, he answered. I was wondering if I should wear a buttonhole. I wouldn't, father, said Kathleen. I don't think it's awfully good form. A lot of people will be wearing them, said Mrs. Skinner. Only clerks and people like that, said Kathleen. The Haywoods have had to ask everybody, you know, and besides, we are in mourning. I wonder if there'll be a collection after the bishop's address, said Mr. Skinner. I should hardly think so, said Mrs. Skinner. I think it would be rather bad form, agreed Kathleen. It's as well to be on the safe side, said Mr. Skinner. I'll give for all of us. I was wondering if 10 shillings would be enough, or if I must give £1. If you give anything, I think you ought to give £1, father, said Kathleen. I'll see when the time comes. I don't want to give less than anyone else, but on the other hand, I see no reason to give more than I need. Kathleen put away her papers in the drawer of the writing table and stood up. She looked at her wristwatch. Is Millicent ready? Asked Mrs. Skinner. There's plenty of time. We're only asked at 4, and I don't think we ought to arrive much before past. I told Davis to bring the car round at 4:15. Generally, Kathleen drove the car, but on grand occasions like this, Davis, who was the gardener, put on his uniform and acted as chauffeur. It looked better when you drove up, and naturally Kathleen didn't much want to drive herself when she was wearing her new jumper. The sight of her mother forcing her fingers one by one into her new gloves reminded her that she must put on her own. She smelt them to see if any odour of the cleaning still clung to them. It was very slight. She didn't believe anyone would notice. At last the door opened and Millicent came in. She wore her widow's weeds. Mrs. Skinner never could get used to them, but of course she knew that Millicent must wear them for a year. It was a pity they didn't suit her. They suited some people. She had tried on Millicent's bonnet once, with its white band and long veil, and thought they looked very well in it. Of course, she hoped dear Alfred would survive her, but if he didn't, she would never go out of weeds. Queen Victoria never had. It was different for Millicent. Millicent was a much younger woman. She was only 36. It was very sad to be a widow at 36, and there wasn't much chance of her marrying again. Kathleen wasn't very likely to marry now. She was 35. Last time Millicent and Harold had come home, she had suggested that they should have Kathleen to stay with them. Harold had seemed willing enough, but Millicent said It wouldn't do. Mrs. Skinner didn't know why not. It would give her a chance. Of course, they didn't want to get rid of her, but a girl ought to marry, and somehow all the men they knew at home were married already. Millicent said the climate was trying. It was true she was a bad colour. No one would think now that Millicent had been the prettier of the two. Kathleen had fined down as she grew older. Of course, some people said she was too thin, but now that she had cut her hair, with her cheeks red from playing golf in all weathers, Mrs. Skinner thought her quite pretty. No one could say that of poor Millicent. She had lost her figure completely. She had never been tall, and now that she had filled out, she looked stocky. She was a good deal too fat. Mrs. Skinner supposed it was due to the tropical heat that prevented her from taking exercise. Her skin was sallow and muddy, and her blue eyes, which had been her best feature, had gone quite pale. She ought to do something about her neck, Mrs. Skinner reflected. She's becoming dreadfully jowly. She had spoken of it once or twice to her husband. He remarked that Millicent wasn't as young as she was. That might be, but she needn't let herself go altogether. Mrs. Skinner made up her mind to talk to her daughter seriously, but of course she must respect her grief, and she would wait till the year was up. She was just as glad to have this reason to put off a conversation, the thought of which made her slightly nervous. For Millicent was certainly changed. There was something sullen in her face, which made her mother not quite at home with her. Mrs. Skinner liked to say aloud all the thoughts that passed through her head, but Millicent, when you made a remark, just to say something, had an awkward habit of not answering, so that you wondered whether she had heard. Sometimes Mrs. Skinner found it so irritating that, not to be quite sharp with Millicent, she had to remind herself that poor Harold had only been dead 8 months. The light from the window fell on the widow's heavy face as she advanced silently, but Kathleen stood with her back to it. She watched her sister for a moment. "Millicent, there's something I want to say to you," she said. "I was playing golf with Gladys Hayward this morning." "Did you beat her?" asked Millicent. Gladys Hayward was the Canon's only unmarried daughter. "She told me something about you which I think you ought to know." Millicent's eyes passed beyond her sister to the little girl watering flowers in the garden. "Have you told Annie to give Joan her tea in the kitchen, Mother?" she said. "Yes, she'll have it when the servants have theirs." Kathleen looked at her sister coolly. "The bishop spent 2 or 3 days at Singapore on his way home," she went on. "He's very fond of travelling. He's been to Borneo, and he knows a good many of the people that you know." He'll be interested to see you, dear," said Mrs. Skinner. "Did he know poor Harold?" "Yes, I met him at Kuala Solor. He remembers him very well. He says he was shocked to hear of his death." Millicent sat down and began to put on her black gloves. It seemed strange to Mrs. Skinner that she received these remarks with complete silence. Oh, Millicent, she said, Harold's photo has disappeared. Have you taken it? Yes, I put it away. I should have thought you'd like to have it out. Once more Millicent said nothing. It really was an exasperating habit. Kathleen turned slightly in order to face her sister. Millicent, why did you tell us that Harold died of fever? The widow made no gesture. She looked at Kathleen with steady eyes, but her sallow skin darkened with a flush. She did not reply. What do you mean, Kathleen? Asked Mr. Skinner with surprise. The bishop says that Harold committed suicide. Mrs. Skinner gave a startled cry, but her husband put out a deprecating hand. Is it true, Millicent? It is. But why didn't you tell us? Millicent paused for an instant. She fingered idly a piece of Brunei brass which stood on a table by her side. That too had been a present from Harold. I thought it better for Joan that her father should be thought to have died of fever. I didn't want her to know anything about it. You've put us in an awfully awkward position, said Kathleen, frowning a little. Gladys Hayward said she thought it rather nasty of me not to have told her the truth. I had the greatest difficulty in getting her to believe that I knew absolutely nothing about it. She said her father was rather put out. He says, after all the years we've known one another, and considering that he married you, and the terms we've been on, and all that, he doesn't think we might have had confidence. He does think we might have had confidence in him, and at all events, if we didn't want to tell him the truth, we needn't have told him a lie. I must say I sympathise with him there, said Mr. Skinner acidly. Of course I told Gladys that we weren't to blame. We only told them what you told us. I hope it didn't put you off your game, said Millicent. Really, my dear, I think that is a most improper observation, exclaimed her father. He rose from his chair, walked over to the empty fireplace, and from force of habit stood in front of it with parted coat-tails. It was my business, said Millicent, and if I chose to keep it to myself, I didn't see why I shouldn't. I agree with her there. It doesn't look as if you had any affection for your mother, if you didn't even tell her, said Mrs. Skinner. Millicent shrugged her shoulders. You might have known it was bound to come out, said Kathleen. Why? I didn't expect that two gossiping old parsons would have nothing else to talk about than me. When the bishop said he'd been to Borneo, it's only natural that the Haywoods should ask him if he knew you and Harold. Oh, that's neither here nor there, said Mr. Skinner. I think you should certainly have told us the truth, and we could have decided what was the best thing to do. As a solicitor, I can tell you that in the long run it only makes things worse if you attempt to hide them. Poor Harold, said Mrs. Skinner, and the tears began to trickle down her raddled cheeks. It seems dreadful. He was always a good son-in-law to me. Whatever induced him to do such a dreadful thing? The climate. I think you'd better give us all the facts, Millicent, said her father. Kathleen will tell you. Kathleen hesitated. What she had to say really was rather dreadful. It seemed terrible that such things should happen to a family like theirs. The bishop says he cut his throat. Mrs. Skinner gasped, and she went impulsively up to her bereaved daughter. She wanted to fold her in her arms. "My poor child," she sobbed, but Millicent withdrew herself. "Please don't fuss me, Mother. I really can't stand being mauled about." "Really, Millicent?" said Mr. Skinner, with a frown. He did not think she was behaving very nicely. Mrs. Skinner dabbed her eyes carefully with her handkerchief, and with a sigh and a little shake of the head, returned to her chair. Kathleen fidgeted with the long chain she wore round her neck. "It does seem rather absurd that I should have to be told the details of my brother-in-law's death by a friend. It makes us all look such fools. The bishop wants very much to see you, Millicent. He wants to tell you how much he feels for you." She paused, but Millicent did not speak. "He says that Millicent had been away with Joan, and when she came back she found poor Harold lying dead on his bed." "It must have been a great shock," said Mr. Skinner. Mrs. Skinner began to cry again, but Kathleen put her hand gently on her shoulder. "Don't cry, Mother," she said. "It'll make your eyes red, and people will think it's so funny." They were all silent while Mrs. Skinner, drying her eyes, made a successful effort to control herself. It seemed very strange to her that this very moment she should be wearing in her toque the ospreys that poor Harold had given her. "There's something else I ought to tell you," said Kathleen. Millicent looked at her sister again, without haste, and her eyes were steady but watchful. She had the look of a person who is waiting for a sound which he is afraid of missing. "I don't want to say anything to wound you, dear," Kathleen went on, "but there's something else, and I think you ought to know it. The bishop says that Harold drank." "Oh, my dear, how dreadful!" cried Mrs. Skinner. "What a shocking thing to say. Did Gladys Hayward tell you? What did you say?" "I said it was entirely untrue." "This is what comes of making secrets of things," said Mr. Skinner irritably. "It's always the same. If you try and hush a thing up, all sorts of rumours get about which are 10 times worse than the truth." They told the bishop in Singapore that Harold had killed himself while he was suffering from delirium tremens. "I think for all our sakes you ought to deny that, Millicent." "Such a dreadful thing to have said about anyone who's dead," said Mrs. Skinner, "and it'll be so bad for Joan when she grows up." "But what is the foundation of the story, Millicent?" asked her father. "Harold was always very abstemious." "Here," said the widow. "Did he drink?" "Like a fish." The answer was so unexpected and the tone so sardonic that all three of them were startled. "Millicent, how can you talk like that of your husband when he's dead?" cried her mother, clasping her neatly gloved hands. "I can't understand you. You've been so strange since you came back. I could never have believed that a girl of mine could take her husband's death like that." "Never mind about that, mother," said Mr. Skinner. "We can go into all that later." He walked to the window and looked out at the sunny little garden and then walked back into the room. He took his pince nez out of his pocket and, though he had no intention of putting them on, wiped them with his handkerchief. Millicent looked at him, and in her eyes unmistakably was a look of irony which was quite cynical. Mr. Skinner was vexed. He had finished his week's work, and he was a free man till Monday morning, though he had told his wife that this garden party was a great nuisance, and he would much sooner have tea quietly in his own garden. He had been looking forward to it. He did not care very much about Chinese missions, but it would be interesting to meet the bishop. And now this. It was not the kind of thing he cared to be mixed up in. It was most unpleasant to be told on a sudden that his son-in-law was a drunkard and a suicide. Millicent was thoughtfully smoothing her white cuffs. Her coolness irritated him, but instead of addressing her, he spoke to his younger daughter. "Why don't you sit down, Kathleen? Surely there are plenty of chairs in the room." Kathleen drew forward a chair and, without a word, seated herself. Mr. Skinner stopped in front of Millicent and faced her. "Of course, I see why you told us Harold had died of fever. I think it was a mistake, because that sort of thing is bound to come out sooner or later. I don't know how far what the bishop has told the Haywoods coincides with the facts, but if you will take my advice, I will tell you everything as circumstantially as you can. Then we can see. We can't hope that it will go no further now that Canon Haywood and Gladys know. In a place like this, people are bound to talk. It will make it easier for all of us if we, at all events, know the exact truth." Mrs. Skinner and Kathleen thought he put the matter very well. They waited for Millicent's reply. She had listened with an impassive face. That sudden flush had disappeared, and it was once more, as usual, pasty and sallow. "I don't think you'll much like the truth if I tell it you," she said. "You must know that you can count on our sympathy and understanding," said Kathleen gravely. Millicent gave her a glance, and the shadow of a smile flickered across her set mouth. She looked slowly at the three of them. Mrs. Skinner had an uneasy impression that she looked at them as though they were mannequins at a dressmaker's. She seemed to live in a different world from theirs and to have no connection with them. Sorry, I'm fidgeting because this is the third time this evening, I keep being told that I need to go to the cemetery. Go visit the cemetery, they said, but they haven't been specific and said which particular cemetery they wish me to visit. And it's a little bit odd. I do sometimes, on rare occasions, go to cemeteries. You know, when I go, it's the Mount Gravatt one to just walk around where the Jewish community are all buried. And yes, and I used to every so often go to Toowong Cemetery because it's absolutely beautiful there and historical. But yeah, it's a bit odd because I don't know anyone who's passed recently, so I have no great desire to take myself down to the cemetery, but oh well. Perhaps someone I know has recently passed and I've not been informed yet, so it might be them trying to get my attention, as often happens when acquaintances pass on. They often come to me, usually within about 3 weeks of their passing. So, yeah, go to the cemetery, they say. Go to the cemetery. Where? I wonder if it's Papa Legba talking to me. It sort of doesn't have his kind of energy though. It feels like a human spirit. It's odd. Oh well, we'll carry on because the truth always comes out in the end, people. If I'm meant to know, and will get revealed in no time at all. Right, where were we? Millicent gave her a glance and a shadow of a smile flickered across her set mouth. She looked, oh that's right, we read that, dear goddess. I'll repeat the last sentence. She seemed to live in a different world from theirs and to have no connection with them. You know, I wasn't in love with Harold when I married him, she said reflectively. Mrs. Skinner was on the point of making an exclamation when a rapid gesture of her husband, barely indicated, but after so many years of married life, perfectly significant, stopped her. Millicent went on. She spoke with a level voice, slowly, and there was little change of expression in her tone. I was 27, and no one else seemed to want to marry me. It's true he was 44, and it seemed rather old, but he had a very good position, hadn't he? I wasn't likely to get a better chance. Mrs. Skinner felt inclined to cry again, but she remembered the party. Of course, I see now why you took his photograph away, she said dolefully. Don't, Mother, exclaimed Kathleen. It had been taken when he was engaged to Millicent, and was a very good photograph of Harold. Mrs. Skinner had always thought him quite a fine man. He was heavily built, tall, and perhaps a little too fat, but he held himself well, and his presence was imposing. He was inclined to be bald even then, but men did go bald very early nowadays, and he said that toupees, sun helmets, were very bad for the hair. He had a small, dark moustache, and his face was deeply burned by the sun. Of course, his best feature was his eyes. They were brown and large, like Joan's. His conversation was interesting. Kathleen said he was pompous, but Mrs. Skinner didn't think him so. She didn't mind it if a man laid down the law, and when she saw as she very soon did, that he was attracted by Millicent. She began to like him very much. He was always very attentive to Mrs. Skinner, and she listened as though she were really interested when he spoke of his district and told her of the big game he had killed. Kathleen said he'd a pretty good opinion of himself, but Mrs. Skinner came of a generation which accepted without question the good opinion that men had of themselves. Millicent saw very soon which way the wind blew, and though she said nothing to her mother knew that if Harold asked her, she was going to accept him. Harold was staying with some people who had been 30 years in Borneo, and they spoke well of the country. There was no reason why a woman shouldn't live there comfortably. Of course, the children had to come home when they were 7, but Mrs. Skinner thought it was unnecessary to trouble about that yet. She asked Harold to dine. She told him they were always in to tea. He seemed to be at a loose end, and when his visit to his old friends was drawing to a close, she told him they would be very much pleased if he would come and spend a fortnight with them. It was towards the end of this that Harold and Millicent became engaged. They had a very pretty wedding. They went to Venice for their honeymoon, and then they started for the East. Millicent wrote from various ports at which the ship touched. She seemed happy. People were very nice to me at Kuala Solor, she said. Kuala Solor was the chief town of the state of Sembulu. We stayed with the resident, and everyone asked us to dinner. Once or twice I heard men ask Harold to have a drink, but he refused. He said he had turned over a new leaf. Now he was a married man. I didn't know why they laughed. Mrs. Gray, the resident's wife, told me they were all so glad Harold was married. She said it was dreadfully lonely for a bachelor on one of the outstations. When we left Kuala Solor, Mrs. Gray said goodbye to me so funnily that I was quite surprised. It was as if she was solemnly putting Harold in my charge. They listened to her in silence. Kathleen never took her eyes off her sister's impassive face, but Mr. Skinner stared straight in front of him at the Malay arms, creases and parangs which hung on the wall above the sofa on which his wife sat. It wasn't till I went back to Kuala Solor a year and a half later that I found out why their manner had seemed so odd. Millicent gave a queer little sound like the echo of a scornful laugh. I knew then a good deal that I hadn't known before. Harold came to England that time in order to marry. He didn't much mind who it was. Do you remember how we spread ourselves out to catch him, Mother? We needn't have taken so much trouble. I don't know what you mean, Millicent, said Mrs. Skinner, not without acerbity, for the insinuation of scheming did not please her. I saw he was attracted by you. Millicent shrugged her heavy shoulders. He was a confirmed drunkard. He used to go to bed every night with a bottle of whisky and empty it before morning. The chief secretary told him he'd have to resign unless he stopped drinking. He said he'd given him one more chance. He could take his leave then and go to England. He advised him to marry so that when he got back he'd have someone to look after him. Harold married me because he wanted a keeper. They took bets in Kuala Solor on how long I'd make him stay sober. But he was in love with you, Mrs. Skinner interrupted. You don't know how he used to speak to me about you, and at that time you're speaking of, when you went to Kuala Solor to have Joan, he wrote me such a charming letter about you. Millicent looked at her mother again, and a deep colour dyed her sallow skin. Her hands, lying on her lap, began to tremble a little. She thought of those first months of her married life. The government launch took them to the mouth of the river, and they spent the night at the bungalow, which Harold said jokingly was their seaside residence. Next day they went upstream to a prahu. From the novel she had read, she expected the rivers of Borneo to be dark and strangely sinister, but the sky was blue, dappled with little white clouds, and the green of the mangroves and the nipas, washed by the flowing water, glistened in the sun. On each side stretched the pathless jungle, and in the distance, silhouetted against the sky, was the rugged outline of a mountain. The air in the early morning was fresh and buoyant. She seemed to enter upon a friendly, fertile land, and she had a sense of spacious freedom. Sorry, I've got a spirit here, and a very large, imposing man. And I don't know them, but I know who they're attached to. It's a bit odd, people are there. Very odd. Go back to the light, spirit. You're not welcome here. Let us continue with the story. They watched the banks for monkeys sitting on the branches of the tangled trees, and once Harold pointed out something that looked like a log and said 'twas a crocodile. The assistant resident in ducks and a topee was on the landing stage to meet them, and a dozen trim little soldiers were lined up to do them honour. The assistant resident was introduced to her. His name was Simpson. "By Jove, sir," he said to Harold, "I'm glad to see you back. It's been deuced lonely without you." The resident's bungalow. Go, spirit. No one invited you into my sacred space. Go and annoy your son. He's got nothing to do with me here. Sorry, I'm being interrupted. The resident's bungalow, surrounded by a garden in which grew wildly all manner of gay flowers, stood on the top of a low hill. It was a trifle shabby, and the furniture was sparse, but the rooms were cool and of generous size. The campong is down there, said Harold, pointing. Her eyes followed his gesture, and from among the coconut trees rose the beating of a gong. It gave her a queer little sensation in the heart. Though she had nothing much to do, the days passed easily enough. At dawn a boy brought them their tea, and they lounged about the veranda, enjoying the fragrance of the morning. Harold in a singlet and a sarong, she in a dressing gown, till it was time to dress for breakfast. I'm really kind of fighting to tune that one out. He says he's the father of a former friend of mine. He hasn't told me his name, so I'm going to continue to ignore it. Don't know why they're bothering me with their nonsense, quite frankly. It's a former friend for a reason, humiliating me at digs. Motherfucker. Right, where was I? Though she had nothing much to do, the days passed easily enough. At dawn a boy brought them their tea, and they lounged around the veranda, enjoying the fragrance of the morning, Harold in a singlet and a sarong, she in a dressing gown, till it was time for breakfast. Then Harold went to his office, and she spent an hour or two learning Malay. After tiffin, I have no idea what tiffin is, he went back to his office while she slept. Do they mean lunch, morning tea, high tea? Should I Google it? I need to know what tiffin is. So it'll keep that entity at bay and I'm busily ignoring it. Honestly, it's getting intense, people of Earth. It really is. Right, here we go. I don't know what they want with me. Treat me badly and think they can send their spooks after me as well. It's ridiculous. Tiffin box is an Indian 4-tier box, so they must mean lunch then. Must be related to. Let me just try again. A snack or light meal, or a cake or dessert made from crushed biscuits, golden syrup and chocolate and chilled in the fridge. Well, that sounds kind of nice, isn't it? What is a tiffin in British slang? Light meals, snacks or packed lunches. Likely comes from the British slang term tiffing, meaning to take a sip. The British in India adopted the practice of having light meals or snacks between regular meals in the early 19th century. A tiffin is a packed lunch for those working in offices or going to school. Right, we know now. We know. We're on it, Pickleball. We know all about that. lost my place. Can you believe it? Bloody hell. Alright, here we are. After tiffin, he went back to his office while she slept. A cup of tea revived them both, and they went for a walk or played golf on the 9-hole links, which Harold had made on a level piece of cleared jungle below the bungalow. Night fell at 6, and Mr. Simpson came along to have a drink. They chatted till their late dinner hour, and sometimes Harold and Mr. Simpson played chess. The balmy evenings were enchanting. The fireflies turned the bushes just below the veranda into coldly sparkling, tremulous beacons, and flowering trees scented the air with sweet odours. I died of a heart attack. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, but how is that relevant to my story? Let's go back to the light. My gods. That may not even be true, by the way, so I'm not going into any of it. No idea what's true and what's not. But didn't I say earlier when I began this video that I felt like something or someone unexpected was arriving? I didn't mean a ghost, by the way, or spirit. I was expecting a physical entity to turn up out of the blue. So here you go. I was half right. Half right, I'll have half. I'll stop it. It is funny when you think about it. Right, here we go. After dinner, they read the papers which had left London 6 weeks before, and presently went to bed. Millicent enjoyed being a married woman, with a house of her own, and she was pleased with the native servants in their gay sarongs who went about the bungalow with bare feet, silent but friendly. It gave her a pleasant sense of importance to be the wife of the resident. Harold impressed her by the fluency with which he spoke the language, by his air of command, and by his dignity. She went into the courthouse now and then to hear him try cases. The multifariousness of his duties and the competent way in which he performed them aroused her respect. Mr. Simpson told her that Harold understood the natives as well as any man in the country. He had the combination of firmness, tact, and good humour which was essential in dealing with that timid, revengeful, and suspicious race. Millicent began to feel a certain admiration for her husband. They had been married nearly a year when 2 English naturalists came to stay with them for a few days on their way to the interior. They brought a pressing recommendation from the governor, and Harold said he wanted to do them proud. Their arrival was an agreeable change. I'll just check how much longer we have. Okay. Millicent asked Mr. Simpson to dinner. He lived at the fort and only dined with them on Sunday nights. And after dinner the men sat down to play bridge. Millicent left them presently and went to bed, but they were so noisy that for some time she could not get to sleep. She did not know at what hour she was awakened by Harold staggering into the room. She kept silent. He made up his mind to have a bath before getting into bed. The bath-house was just below their room, and he went down the steps that led to it. Apparently he slipped, for there was a great clatter, and he began to swear. Then he was violently sick. She heard him sluice the buckets of water over himself, and in a little while, walking very cautiously this time, he crawled up the stairs and slipped into bed. Millicent pretended to be asleep. She was disgusted. Harold was drunk. She made up her mind to speak about it in the morning. What would the naturalists think of her? But in the morning Harold was so dignified that she hadn't quite the determination to refer to the matter. At 8, Harold and she, with their 2 guests, sat down to breakfast. Harold looked round the table. "Porridge," he said. "Millicent, your guests might manage a little Worcester sauce for breakfast, but I don't think they'll much fancy anything else. Personally, I shall content myself with a whisky and soda." The naturalists laughed, but shamefacedly. "Your husband's a terror," said one of them. "I should not think I had properly performed the duties of hospitality if I sent you sober to bed on the first night of your visit," said Harold, with his round, stately way of putting things. Millicent, smiling acidly, was relieved to think that her guests had been as drunk as her husband. The next evening she sat up with them, and the party broke up at a reasonable hour, but she was glad when the strangers went on with their journey. Their life resumed its placid course. Some months later, Harold went on a tour of inspection of his district and came back with a bad attack of malaria. This was the first time she had seen the disease of which she had heard so much, and when he recovered it did not seem strange to her that Harold was very shaky. She found his manner peculiar. He would come back from the office and stare at her with glazed eyes. He would stand on the veranda, swaying slightly but still dignified, and make long harangues about the political situation in England. Losing the thread of his discourse, he would look at her with an archness which his natural stateliness made somewhat disconcerting, and say, "Pulls you down dreadfully, this confounded malaria. Ah, little woman, you little know the strain it puts upon a man to be an empire builder." She thought that Mr. Simpson began to look worried, and once or twice when they were alone he seemed on the point of saying something to her which his shyness at the last moment prevented. The feeling grew so strong that it made her nervous, and one evening, when Harold, she knew not why, had remained later than usual at the office, she tackled him. "What have you got to say to me, Mr. Simpson?" she broke out suddenly. He blushed and hesitated. "Nothing. What makes you think I have anything in particular to say to you?" Mr. Simpson was a thin, weedy youth of 24, with a fine head of waving hair which he took great pains to plaster down very flat. His wrists were swollen and scarred with mosquito bites. Millicent looked at him steadily. "If it's something to do with Harold, don't you think it would be kinder to tell me frankly?" He grew scarlet now. He shuffled uneasily on his rattan chair. She insisted. "I'm afraid you'll think it awful cheek," he said at last. "It's rotten of me to say anything about my chief behind his back. Malaria's a rotten thing, and after one's had a bout of it, one feels awfully down and out." He hesitated again. The corners of his mouth sagged as if he were going to cry. To Millicent, he seemed like a little boy. "I'll be as silent as the grave," she said with a smile, trying to conceal her apprehension. "Do tell me." "I think it's a pity your husband keeps a bottle of whisky at the office. He's apt to take a nip more often than he otherwise would." Mr. Simpson's voice was hoarse with agitation. Millicent felt a sudden coldness shiver through her. She controlled herself, for she knew that she must not frighten the boy if they were to get out of him all there was to tell. He was unwilling to speak. She pressed him, wheedling, appealing to his sense of duty, and at last she began to cry. When he told her that Harold had been drunk more or less for the last fortnight, the natives were talking about it, and they said that soon he would be as bad as he had been before his marriage. He had been in the habit of drinking a good deal too much then, but details of that time, notwithstanding all her attempts, Mr. Simpson resolutely declined to give her. "Do you think he's drinking now?" she asked. "I don't know." Millicent felt herself on a sudden hot with shame and anger. The fort, as it was called because the rifles and the ammunition were kept there, was also the courthouse. It stood opposite the residence bungalow in a garden of its own. The sun was just about to set and she did not need a hat. She got up and walked across. She found Harold sitting in the office behind the large hall in which he administered justice. There was a bottle of whisky in front of him. He was smoking cigarettes and talking to 3 or 4 Malays who stood in front of him, listening with obsequious and at the same time scornful smiles. His face was red. The natives vanished. "I came to see what you were doing," she said. He rose, for he always treated her with elaborate politeness, and lurched. Feeling himself unsteady, he assumed an elaborate stateliness of demeanour. "Take a seat, my dear. Take a seat. I was detained by press of work." She looked at him with angry eyes. "You're drunk," she said. He stared at her, his eyes bulging a little, and a haughty look gradually traversed his large and fleshy face. "I haven't the remotest idea what you mean," he said. That's probably a possum. She had been ready with a flow of wrathful expostulation, but suddenly she burst into tears. She sank into a chair and hid her face. Harold looked at her for an instant. Then the tears began to trickle down his own cheeks. He came towards her with outstretched arms and fell heavily on his knees. Sobbing, he clasped her to him. Forgive me, he said. "I promise you it shall not happen again. It was that damned malaria." "It's so humiliating," she moaned. He wept like a child. There was something very touching in the self-abasement of that big, dignified man. Presently Millicent looked up. His eyes, appealing and contrite, sought hers. "Will you give me your word of honour that you'll never touch liquor again?" Yes, I hate it." 'Twas then she told him that she was with child. He was overjoyed. That is the one thing I wanted. That'll keep me straight. They went back to the bungalow. Harold bathed himself and had a nap. After dinner they talked long and quietly. He admitted that before he married her he had occasionally drunk more than was good for him. In outstations it was easy to fall into bad habits. He agreed to everything that Millicent asked, and during the months before it was necessary for her to go to Kuala Solor for her confinement, Harold was an excellent husband, tender, thoughtful, proud, and affectionate. He was irreproachable. A launch came to fetch her. She was to leave him for 6 weeks, and he promised faithfully to drink nothing during her absence. He put his hands on her shoulders. "I never break a promise," he said in his dignified way. "But even without it, can you imagine that while you are going through so much, I should do anything to increase your troubles?" Joan was born. Millicent stayed at the residence, and Mrs. Gray, his wife, a kindly creature of middle age, was very good to her. The two women had little to do during the long hours they were alone, but to talk, and in course of time Millicent learnt everything there was to know of her husband's alcoholic past. The fact which she found most difficult to reconcile herself to was that Harold had been told that the only condition upon which he would be allowed to keep his post was that he should bring back a wife. It caused in her a dull feeling of resentment, and when she discovered what a persistent drunkard he had been, she felt vaguely uneasy. She had a horrid fear that during her absence he would not have been able to resist the craving. She went home with her baby and a nurse. She spent a month at the mouth of the river and sent a messenger in a canoe to announce her arrival. She scanned the landing stage anxiously as the launch approached it. Harold and Mr. Simpson were standing there. The trim little soldiers were lined up. Her heart sank, for Harold was swaying slightly, like a man who keeps his balance on a rolling ship, and she knew he was drunk. It wasn't a very pleasant homecoming. She had almost forgotten her mother and father and her sister, who sat there silently listening to her. Now she roused herself and became once more aware of their presence. All that she spoke of seemed very far away. "I knew that I hated him then," she said. "I could have killed him." "Oh, Millicent, don't say that," cried her mother. "Don't forget that he's dead, poor man." Millicent looked at her mother, and for a moment a scowl darkened her impassive face. Mr. Skinner moved uneasily. "Go on," said Kathleen. "When he found out that I knew all about him, he didn't bother very much more. In 3 months he had another attack of DTs. "Why didn't you leave him?" said Kathleen. "What would have been the good of that? He would have been dismissed from the service in a fortnight. Who was to keep me and Joan? I had to stay. And when he was sober, I had nothing to complain of. He wasn't in the least in love with me, but he was fond of me. I hadn't married him because I was in love with him, but because I wanted to be married. I did everything I could to keep liquor from him. I managed to get Mr. Gray to prevent whisky being sent from Kuala Solor, but he got it from the Chinese. I watched him as a cat watches a mouse. He was too cunning for me. In a little while he had another outbreak. He neglected his duties. I was afraid complaints would be made. We were 2 days from Kuala Solor, and that was our safeguard, but I suppose something was said, for Mr. Gray wrote a private letter of warning to me. I showed it to Harold. He stormed and blustered, but I saw he was frightened, and for 2 or 3 months he was quite sober. Then he began again, and so it went on till our leave became due. Before we came to stay here, I begged and prayed him to be careful. I didn't want any of you to know what sort of man I had married. All the time he was in England, he was all right, and before we sailed I warned him. He'd grown to be very fond of Joan and very proud of her, and she was devoted to him. She always liked him better than she liked me. I asked him if he wanted to have his child grow up knowing that he was a drunkard, and I found out that at last I'd got a hold on him. The thought terrified him. I told him that I wouldn't allow it, and if he ever let Joan see him drunk, I'd take her away from him at once. Do you know, he grew quite pale when I said it. I fell on my knees that night and thanked God, because I'd found a way of saving my husband. He told me that if I would stand by him, he would have another try. We made up our minds to fight the thing together, and he tried so hard. When he felt as though he must drink, he came to me. You know, he was inclined to be rather pompous. With me, he was so humble. He was like a child. He depended on me. Perhaps he didn't love me when he married me, but he loved me then, me and Joan. I'd hated him because of the humiliation, because when he was drunk and tried to be dignified and impressive, he was loathsome. But now I got a strange feeling in my heart. It wasn't love, but it was a queer, shy tenderness. He was something more than my husband. He was like a child that I'd carried under my heart for long, weary months. He was so proud of me, and, you know, I was proud too. His long speeches didn't irritate me any more, and I only thought his stately ways rather funny and charming. At last we won. For 2 years he never touched a drop. He lost his craving entirely. He was even able to joke about it. Mr. Simpson had left us then, and we had another young man called Francis. I'm a reformed drunkard, you know, Francis, Harold said to him once. If it hadn't been for my wife, I'd have been sacked long ago. I've got the best wife in the world, Francis. You don't know what it meant to me to hear him say that. I felt that all I'd gone through was worthwhile. I was so happy. She was silent. She thought of the broad, yellow and turbid water on whose banks she had lived so long, the egrets, white and gleaming in the tremulous sunset, flew down the stream in a flock, flew low and swift and scattered. They were like a ripple of snowy notes, sweet and pure and spring-like. Now I'm being told to go to King Island to visit my dead relatives. Put their ashes there. I have no intention of going there, Spirit. What is this wanting me to go and pay obeisance to the dead tonight, wanting me to visit cemeteries and the repository of Gisela, David and Case? Why would I go there? Fuck that shit. Seriously. Last time I went to visit them at King Island, a spirit, I don't know even if it was even my relatives, tried to follow me home. Up on my back feet it was. I got about halfway on that walk back from the island and I had to do a miniature exorcism to shake it off so I wouldn't have it get in the car and come home with me. Creepy it was. Creepy as fuck. How long ago was that now? It's been about 4 or 5 years now. Haven't been back there since. It's really off-putting. The dead are dancing, they said. Well might they dance. There's lots to dance about. Rejoice in this life or rejoice in the afterlife. Take your pick. Don't waste your life on feckless fools and misery. Right, where were we? They were like a ripple of snowy notes, sweet and pure and spring-like, which an unseen hand drew forth, a divine arpeggio from an unseen harp. They fluttered, did you hear that bang? Possums. They fluttered along between the green banks, wrapped in the shadows of evening, like the happy thoughts of a contented mind. The scrub turkey flew up on top of my neighbour Timsar's roof with, a stainless steel bowl about that big that I keep the lorikeet mix in for the lorikeets. Took it up on top of Timsar's roof. How am I going to get that back now? By the gods. Those wild birds are driving me crazy. Who takes someone's bowl and puts it up on a roof? I mean, it was just odd. I was out there going, give me back my stainless steel bowl, you little turd. But it was happily playing with it. And the crow was getting in on it as well. Oh well. If I'm lucky, it'll fall down off the roof and Timson might see it and throw it back to me. Or I might have to ask him to keep an eye out for it. But yeah, anarchy and chaos today at Sacred Space. The wild birds were really mischievous too. We continue with the story. Then Joan fell ill. For 3 weeks we were very anxious. There was no doctor nearer than Kuala Solor. Ouch, pins and needles. And we had to put up with the treatment of a native dispenser. When she grew well again, I took her down to the mouth of the river in order to give her a breath of sea air. We stayed there a week. It was the first time I had been separated from Harold since I went away to have Joan. There was a fishing village on piles not far from us, but really we were quite alone. I thought a great deal about Harold so tenderly, and all at once I knew that I loved him. I was so glad when the prahu came to fetch us back, because I wanted to tell him. I thought it would mean a good deal to him. I can't tell you how happy I was. As we rowed upstream, the head man told me that Mr. Francis had had to go up country to arrest a woman who had murdered her husband. He had been gone a couple of days. I was surprised that Harold was not on the landing stage to meet me. He was always very punctilious about that sort of thing. He used to say that husband and wife should treat one another as politely as they treated acquaintances, and I could not imagine what business had prevented him. I walked up the little hill on which the bungalow stood. The ayah brought Joan behind me. The bungalow was strangely silent. There seemed to be no servants about, and I could not make it out. I wondered if Harold hadn't expected me so soon and was out. I went up the steps. Joan was thirsty, and the ayah took her to the servants' quarters to give her something to drink. Harold was not in the sitting room. I called him, but there was no answer. I was disappointed because I should have liked him to be there. I went into our bedroom. Harold wasn't out after all. He was lying on the bed asleep. I was really very much amused because he always pretended he never slept in the afternoon. He said it was an unnecessary habit that we white people got into. I went up to the bed softly. I thought I would have a joke with him. I opened the mosquito curtains. He was lying on his back with nothing on but a sarong, and there was an empty whiskey bottle by his side. He was drunk. It had begun again. All my struggles for so many years were wasted. My dream was shattered. It was all hopeless. I was seized with rage. Millicent's face grew once again darkly red, and she clenched the arms of the chair she sat in. I took him by the shoulders and shook him with all my might. "You beast!" I cried. "You beast!" I was so angry. I don't know what I did. I don't know what I said. I kept on shaking him. You don't know how loathsome he looked, that large, fat man, half naked. He hadn't shaved for days. His face was bloated and purple. He was breathing heavily. I shouted at him, but he took no notice. I tried to drag him out of bed, but he was too heavy. He lay there like a log. "Open your eyes!" I screamed. I shook him again. I hated him. I hated him all the more because for a week I'd loved him with all my heart. He'd let me down. He'd let me down. I wanted to tell him what a filthy beast he was. I could make no impression on him. "You shall open your eyes," I cried. I was determined to make him look at me. The widow licked her dry lips. Her breath seemed hurried. She was silent. If he was in that state, I should have thought it best to have let him go on sleeping, said Kathleen. There was a parang on the wall by the side of the bed. You know how fond Harold was of curios. What's a parang? Said Mrs. Skinner. Don't be silly, mother, her husband replied irritably. There's one on the wall, immediately behind you. He pointed to the Malay sword on which, for some reason, his eyes had been unconsciously resting. Mrs. Skinner drew quickly into the corner of the sofa with a little frightened gesture, as though she had been told that a snake lay curled up beside her. Suddenly the blood spurted out from Harold's throat. There was a great red gash right across it. Millicent! Cried Kathleen, springing up and almost leaping towards her. What in God's name do you mean? Mrs. Skinner stood staring at her with wide, startled eyes, her mouth open. The parang wasn't on the wall any more. It was on the bed. Then Harold opened his eyes. They were just like Joan's. I don't understand, said Mr. Skinner. How could he have committed suicide if he was in the state you describe? Kathleen took her sister's arm and shook her angrily. Millicent, for God's sake, explain. Millicent released herself. The parang was on the wall, I told you. I don't know what happened. There was all the blood, and Harold opened his eyes. He died almost at once. He never spoke, but he gave a sort of gasp. At last, Mr. Skinner found his voice. But, you wretched woman, it was murder. Millicent, her face mottled with red, gave him such a look of scornful hatred that he shrank back. Mrs. Skinner cried out, Millicent, you didn't do it, did you? Then Millicent did something that made them all feel as though their blood were turned to ice in their veins. She chuckled. I don't know who else did, she said. My God, muttered Mr. Skinner. Kathleen had been standing bolt upright with her hands to her heart, as though its beating were intolerable. And what happened then, she said. I screamed. I went to the window and flung it open. I called for the ayah. She came across the compound with Joan. Not Joan, I cried. Don't let her come. She called the cook and told him to take the child. I cried to her to hurry, and when she came I showed her Harold. The Tuan's killed himself. I cried. She gave a scream and ran out of the house. No one would come near. They were all frightened out of their wits. I wrote a letter to Mr. Francis, telling him what had happened and asking him to come at once. How do you mean you told him what had happened? I said on my return from the mouth of the river I'd found Harold with his throat cut. You know, in the tropics, you have to bury people quickly. I got a Chinese coffin and the soldiers dug a grave behind the fort. When Mr. Francis came, Harold had been buried for nearly 2 days. He was only a boy. I could do anything I wanted with him. I told him I'd found the parang in Harold's hand, and there was no doubt he'd killed himself in an attack of delirium tremens. I showed him the empty bottle. That sounded like a bird shaking their feathers. Odd, The birds are further down the hall. I wouldn't hear them from here. Ah, it's a mistra wind stirs up the witchy side of me. Am I paying attention to it? Right. I showed him the empty bottle. The servant said he'd been drinking hard ever since I left to go to the sea. I told the same story at Kuala Solor. Everyone was very kind to me, and the government granted me a pension. For a little while nobody spoke. At last Mr. Skinner gathered himself together. I am a member of the legal profession. I'm a solicitor. I have certain duties. We've always had a most respectable practice. You've put me in a monstrous position. He fumbled, searching for the phrases that played at hide and seek in his scattered wits. Millicent looked at him with scorn. What are you going to do about it? It was murder, that's what it was. Do you think I can possibly connive at it? Don't talk nonsense, father, said Kathleen sharply. You can't give up your own daughter. You've put me in a monstrous position, he repeated. Millicent shrugged her shoulders again. You made me tell you, and I've borne it long enough by myself. It was time that all of you bore it too. At that moment, the door was opened by the maid. Davis has brought the car round, sir, she said. Kathleen had the presence of mind to say something, and the maid withdrew. We'd better be starting, said Millicent. I can't go to the party now, cried Mrs. Skinner with horror. I'm far too upset. How can we face the Haywoods? And the bishop will want to be introduced to you. Millicent made a gesture of indifference. Her eyes held their ironical expression. We must go, Mother, said Kathleen. It would look so funny if we stayed away. She turned on Millicent furiously. Oh, I think the whole thing is such frightfully bad form. Mrs. Skinner looked helplessly at her husband. He went to her and gave her his hand to help her up from the sofa. I'm afraid we must go, Mother, he said. And me with the ospreys in my toque that Harold gave me with his own hands, she moaned. He led her out of the room. Kathleen followed close on their heels, and a step or two behind came Millicent. You'll get used to it, you know, she said quietly. At first I thought of it all the time, but now I forget it for 2 or 3 days together. It's not as if there was any danger. They did not answer. They walked through the hall and out of the front door. The 3 ladies got into the back of the car, and Mr. Skinner seated himself beside the driver. They had no self-starter. It was an old car, and Davis went to the bonnet to crank it up. Mr. Skinner looked round and looked petulantly at Millicent. I ought never to have been told, he said. I think it was most selfish of you. Davis took a seat, and they drove off to the Cannons' garden party. And that, my friends, country people, is a classic example of the British stiff upper lip and glory and valour. Oh, you have to laugh. Right, we'll continue tomorrow with another reading. I'm tired now, and it's 2.5 hours, and that's enough today, I think, especially with the interruptions from the wee ghosty. It seems to have gone now. You don't give them attention. Yeah, and sometimes, go on their merry way, but it's a bit odd. It's a bit odd that's happening again. I'll be monitoring that carefully, and I'll be dealing with it appropriately if it continues. Not cool, and I won't be keeping a stiff British upper lip about it at all, because it's a boundary violation, people there. Anyway, on that note, have a beautiful evening wherever you are. It's bang on 9 p.m. on the 1st of July 2025. So have a wonderful evening. We started with a horror story and we ended with a murder story. So interesting, good old W. Somerset Maugham. So blessed be, and I'll talk to you no doubt again tomorrow or in the ensuing days, whatever comes first. Alright, take good care, be of good cheer, and remember, as always, never ever to let the bastards grind you down, the living or the dead. Boundaries, people. Blessed be. And my little mouse doesn't want to work. Here we go. Bye for now.